packed by 3 Parsi gentlemen and 7 Britishers. And the chamber over the years has been interactive with the growth of industry, and there are various sectors which we are very effective in. In the past 20 years or so, we have had special emphasis on the MSME sector, and most of our big corporates ensure that there's a lot of hand holding which is done for the smaller members in order to see that they grow. Another thing which we did recently was we appealed to our members for contribution in order to support the government hospitals within the Mumbai region, just as the pandemic had hit. And we had a lot of contributors which put in both cash and kind, and we helped around 6 hospitals, which were Sir JJ Hospital, KEM, Kasturba, Sion Hospital, Nair Hospital, where a lot of relief was given to the COVID workers, consumables as well as heavy duty machinery. Like JJ Hospital needed an X-ray machine, and the chamber was able to contribute. So as far as this is concerned, we've been very, very active. Along with GIZ, Germany, BCCI has developed a COVID-19 preventive kit and distributed it among the frontline workers, like the sanitization workers, police department, and government officials. And this was again very, very well appreciated by them. So in short, apart from looking at what we do as far as the corporates and are concerned in advocacy and advising both the central government ministry, the state government, as well as regulatory bodies like SEBI, Vagara, we are always looking at how we can contribute towards the city. So this was one of the things which we did. Even during the water crisis in Latur, BCCI had appealed to members, taken contribution, and arranging some water tankers being sent at that point of time by the railway. So without taking any further time, I would hand it over to Veer Raghavan and Toby to take this forward, as you all would be wanting to listen to on the topic, which is very, very important. Thank you, and over to you, Veer Raghavan.
Thank you, Sandeep. Thank you. When we are discussing biosecurity threats and the threat of pandemic in the future, as we exit one pandemic, what lies ahead, I just wanted to put a red herring to all those who are listening in. The finance minister referred to Rahul Gandhi as doomsday man in parliament. While some of what we say may be looking at threats that may come about, please don't think of us as doomsday people. The reason why we are here is to try and unfold scenarios in front of you so that you can be more prepared for what is to come. Maybe you can go back and think, if you had awareness of the possibility of a pandemic and the result that it can cause to economy and the entire disruptions that it may cause, you might have been better prepared to face it. Now that brings me to the next question, which is, obviously Toby Simon and Dr. Gifty Emmanuel are the experts on the field. I'm just here to facilitate this conversation. But the question is, why should you listen to Synergia? What is the locus standi of Synergia to give you a simulation or a threat assessment or ideas on how you can be prepared? Without the intention here is not to plug Synergia, but to emphasize upon you the work that Synergia as a foundation has done over the last 3 decades. And the fact that this foundation, in association with leading institutes like the IIM Bangalore, IIT Kharagpur, had in 2008 simulated a pandemic, avian flu pandemic, and the end result that could happen, which was very similar to what we saw in 2020. The idea was for people to be aware that this could be a threat. And we will talk a little bit more about that with Toby and Dr. Gifty Emmanuel, but I'd just like to play one video of the work that Synergia has done. And again, the intention here is not to plug Synergia, but to impress upon you the background with which Synergia comes up with its assessments and shares its point of view, just to make sure that you are aware of the work that we've done in the past, so that you take what we say with that level of confidence and trust. So I'm just going to play this video, which just narrates the Synergia story over the last, it's just a very short 3-minute video. It narrates the Synergia story over the last 3 decades. And that should, I'm just going to share my screen with this. Just 1 second. Sorry, we're just trying to.
The world was shifting on its pivot with the death of Ayatollah Khomeini, the supreme leader of Iran, and the suppression of democratic protest at Tiananmen Square, China. The rivets in the Iron Curtain were beginning to pop, first in Poland with the Solidarity movement, followed by the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dismantling of apartheid in South Africa. Having witnessed these events, we were deeply affected and began to ask ourselves what we could do to impact the lives of people having to cope with such tectonic shifts. A timely meeting with Mr. Ahmed Kathrada, the prison mate of Nelson Mandela's for 26 years, and subsequent visits by us to South Africa, helped better understand the plight of people living under extreme conditions of apartheid and the epidemic of AIDS in the African continent. The genesis of the Synergia Foundation began with her decade-long work with Nobel Prize winner Médecins Sans Frontières and World Health Organization in building affordable treatment paradigms for AIDS that have saved the lives of millions of afflicted patients in Africa and around the world. This pro bono effort helped us realize that it takes only a few people with the right intent to make an impact. Working with several international organizations, including the International Red Cross and Pharmaciens Sans Frontières, Synergia helped in coordinating relief efforts for more than 200 humanitarian missions in Africa, Central America, and Asia, including earthquakes in Maharashtra, Peru, Gujarat, and the tsunami that affected southern India. The bombing of the World Trade Center in New York brought about a paradigm shift in global security, and the focus has now gravitated from traditional security to human security. The foundation soon realized that its evolved strength was in providing deeper, multidisciplinary insights to governments, security practitioners, industry, and civil society on the causality of such disproportionate threats. The 6 international Synergia conclaves on human security held in Bangalore have provided both insights and intervention techniques to key stakeholders. The Synergia Foundation has brought some of the finest strategic thinkers in the world, including M.K. Narayanan, former NSA to Government of India, Carl Bildt, former Prime Minister of Sweden, Joseph S. Nye, former Dean of Harvard Kennedy School, Michael Chertoff, former Secretary, U.S. Homeland Security, Shiv Shankar Menon, former NSA to the Prime Minister of India, Uzi Arad, National Security Advisor to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Melissa Hathaway, former Cybersecurity Advisor to Presidents Bush and Obama, Sir David Oman, former Permanent Secretary of the UK Home Office, and G.K. Pillai, former Home Secretary, Government of India. It has been a constant endeavor of Synergia to stay ahead of the learning curve by collaborating with some of the finest academia, including the Welfare Center at Harvard University, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and acclaimed think tanks in the world, including Chatham House in the UK, the Munich Security Conference in Germany, and the Center for New American Security in the United States. Synergia's experiences have been consolidated in bodies of knowledge, shared with clients, collaborated with partners, and enhanced through new associations. The Foundation works to provide preventive and preemptive solutions to corporate executive boards and governments, and help clients reimagine their business in an asymmetric world. To know more or engage with us, do call us.
That's the video. I hope those who are viewing and were able to go through that video.
Sri S.K. Patanaik, sir, Additional Chief Secretary Home, in our parlance, ACS Home, was Principal Secretary Energy He has represented India for over 3 years in FAO Rome, Italy.
I'm sorry, there is...
Has served in the GOK in various capacities. Sri M.N. Reddy, Additional Director General of Police Law and Order, with more than 30 years of experience, like I said. He's a winner of...
Right, sorry, I think there was an auxiliary video that also played out there. So I just want to start off by asking Toby, while we, with all the work that Synergia has done, why do you think it's extremely important for a business to be aware of pandemics? And once Toby answers that, then Dr. Gifty will go over his presentation on the potential scenarios that can unfold. Toby.
Good morning, Sandeep, and good morning, Praveen. And now, first of all, thank you for giving us this opportunity to share some of our insights, mostly based on the work that we have done in geosecurity and pandemics in the last, let's say, 25, 30 years. So the first question is, why is understanding a pandemic important? Okay, so we'll go with this little tagline which says, we will all fail at some point in time, but we should learn how to fail smartly. Okay. As a think tank, as a group, we have had several encounters with pandemics and similar issues since 2000. And because our genesis has always been humanitarian, so we have had our nose to the floor. Pandemic is not only a disruptor, okay, as you see in many disruptions, it's a showstopper. So we need to look at pandemics more than looking at a business continuity planning issue. It has implications that go wide. It goes to business, it goes to society, and it goes to governance. So let me tell you why it is important to business. One, it disrupts your entire supply chain. This time we saw parts of it coming up, that supply chains were disrupted in many parts of the world, and I'm sure you would have also faced it in Mumbai, from shortages of raw material in pharmaceuticals to automobile parts. The second is it is a big disruption to critical infrastructure, including our internet, electricity, water, transportation, and most importantly, the healthcare service. Third, it's a huge disruption to logistics, which is free movement of goods, north, south, east, west. When it comes to governance, there is, pandemics causes changes in global power narratives. And you might see more and more, let's say, populist governments coming around the world because people become very affected, they feel very unhappy, and they start protesting. So the consequence of populism is something that we are seeing, but there is something that can add more to it if it moves from populism to anarchy. The second is shift in global power dynamics. We always used to say that whoever is able to find the vaccine first will be able to dominate global politics for at least the next 10 years. And so there was a big scramble between countries, between Russia, China, United States, Europe. And it was, for us, very similar to the dropping of the atom bomb. When the atom bomb was dropped, until then, America as a global power was an outlier. But the moment the bomb was dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, you saw America emerging as the numero power along with the Russians. So you see that sort of shifts in global power dynamics happen. And finally, the question of the impact on civil society, which is something that we should be very mindful of. One is loss of our loved ones, which basically sets us back by many years. Second is loss of jobs and incomes, which is also a severe consequence that we have to face. And third, and the biggest challenge will be the cartelization of wealth, where you're seeing companies that are built on platforms becoming richer and richer, and people who are working in the traditional brick and mortar manufacturing jobs losing jobs, which means from a governance perspective, the governments will have a bigger challenge on how to redistribute wealth. So I'm just outlining few of the challenges, because each one of this that we have spoken will affect the way you do business, because we cannot remain isolated and say, oh, that's something happening outside. No, Today, a pandemic, because of the fact that people travel happening in Africa can affect us. Something happening in Russia can affect us. So we are all linked. And there's no way we can put compartments in silos. So with this, I think I would have probably given a draft and a sort of an outline. We can get back into this more during our Q&A. And why we believe, and I conclude here, that we are different is because we have forewarned. We have actually warned about this in 2007. We simulated it in 2008. 2010, we sent notes to the National Security Council and the agency saying that this is not a healthcare problem. This is more a national security problem. These are all documented. And then in 13, our foundation did a simulation on chemical, biological, and nuclear warfare. 15, we again warned. 17, we cautioned businessmen to reimagine their business because it's going to change. We talked about asymmetry in business, which included pandemics. As a think tank, our job is only to raise the flags, but not go into advocacy, because then we lose our track. So we remain just committed to what we have to say, and we keep saying it, but without raising fear. So that's why we don't go to press. When we say this, we only talk to key stakeholders. It could be in academia, business, research. This is our remit, and this is what we do. Thank you. Over back to Veera.
Yeah, like Toby pointed out, we don't want to be doomsday people. We just want the industry and every stakeholder concerned to be aware of the problems and the projections that can be there. And of course, our own doomsday doctor, is Dr. Gifty Emmanuel. He is the one who comes up with he has come up with several projections. We've written, Synergia as a foundation has written consistently on the vaccine issues and what needs to be done. And all the time we've been about 2-3 months ahead of the process of exiting this lockdown and the process of vaccinating an entire population. So Dr. Gifty Emmanuel will outline for us, for all of you, the potential pandemic threats that exist in the world from the medical point of view and what needs to be done potentially to be more prepared as a society and as industry for it. Dr. Emmanuel.
Thank you, Veera. That was a nice introduction. First of all, let me thank the Bombay Chamber for having me, Mr. Sandeep Khosla, Praveen Nande, and our founder, Toby Simon of Synergia, and facilitator, Veera Raghavan. I think we are, can we have the first slide, please? Yeah. We are in a biological era. The usual impression for anyone is a nuclear weapon is the ultimate nemesis for anyone who thinks of progressing or the human race to progress to the next level. We always think of the nuclear weapon as the final deterrent. But that is over. We are in a biological era, and a biological apocalypse can be much more potent and underestimated compared to a nuclear disaster or a nuclear winter. So why is biology so intricately connected with this? Because we are, for the simple fact, we are biological beings, and our survival and our extinction is directly related to biological events. So in a way, we as human beings cannot really kind of neglect this concept of a biological apocalypse, which can happen at any point in time. We are always under constant threat of biological events. We are very aware of geophysical events like floods, rains, and thunderstorms, but we are less mindful of biological events. It is the biological events which have a direct correlation with the human population. So what is biosecurity? It's a new terminology, but it simply means saving ourselves or securing ourselves against a biological event of mass proportions or gargantuan proportions. So this is very important that everybody in this world understands this terminology. By understanding this, we become more informed, and we will be able to prevent this or have deterrence in many areas and walks of life. So there is a usual saying, first world, second world, or third world. I wish to say there is only one world, and there is only one health, and there is only one trade. There are different shades of it. There are different forms of it. But we don't have the stratification in reality. A virus or a bacteria doesn't see any of this. For it, it chooses its host, and we shouldn't become accidental or intentional hosts. So that is how the whole talk is about. I'm an infectious disease physician, and I'm the scientific director of Synergia Foundation. So in the next few slides, I'll be taking you through what an epidemic or an outbreak can do. We are not exclusively dealing with COVID because so much has been said about COVID. There's nothing absolutely left to be said. So I'll be dealing with the outbreak which is happening currently in this world, which many of us are unaware of. Can I have the next slide, please? So this is an outbreak called Chapare virus. As the name suggests, it's a South American outbreak, and this is a Bolivian hemorrhagic fever. When we say hemorrhagic fever, it means this fever can cause bleeding. Dengue is a hemorrhagic fever, but it's very mild. We find it very difficult to manage dengue. Diseases like Ebola and Marburg and Bolivia, hemorrhagic fever have a higher mortality rate. They have higher death rate, and they are extremely difficult to handle because dengue at the maximum has 2 to 3% mortality, but an outbreak like Chapare or Ebola or even Marburg and Crimean Congo can have very serious consequences, especially in populous cities like Mumbai or Calcutta or Delhi. Management of these outbreaks can be extremely difficult. Next slide, please. So this is what really happens. As you can see on the top right corner, there's the bleeding of the eyes. You will bleed through all orifices. And there at the bottom is a person with what we call as rash or ecchymosis, subcutaneous bleeding. And how does this happen? We are all in very close relation with animals, wild animals as well as domestic animals. Domestic animals like the dogs, cats, pets. Now we are all getting exotic pets, especially in Western countries. They have pets like raccoons to python and exotic snakes even. So this close human-animal association can result in transmission of a lot of diseases, and this is something everybody needs to know. So this in South American mountains, they live in very close relation with animals, especially sheep and cattle and livestock. So ticks and other small insects can transmit such viruses from animals to humans. And this is a process called a zoonosis. And as you know, even COVID is a zoonotic disease. It is presumed that it came from bat reservoirs with an intermediate reservoir like pangolin or even a smaller mammal. Next slide, please. So rats have been implicated in the Chapare outbreak. Rats are also responsible for another hemorrhagic fever called Lassa fever in Africa. So this rat, I still remember in 1994, I had just graduated and we had the Surat outbreak, which was very close to Mumbai. In fact, it shook the whole of the nation. Flights were banned, economic losses were innumerable, and a lot of fatalities, 100 plus. And the greatest thing which happened in Surat outbreak was there was a mass exodus of doctors from Surat. In fact, plague is 100% curable if it detected in the right time. We had an effective drug, we had an effective vaccine, we had effective antidotes. Still, the medical workforce ran out of Surat, mass exodus of medical workforce, and people were literally staying there without any kind of healthcare assistance, and borders were sealed. There was a lot of panic. So rats can be responsible for many outbreaks, and rats are also responsible for plague outbreak. In Surat, we had a lot of rat fall. There was a preceding flood that led to the covering up all burrows where rats dwell. And when the rats died, obviously the fleas from the rats were able to transmit the bacteria called Yersinia pestis, which calls bubonic plague, which is a pestilence which is mentioned in the scriptures. It is mentioned in everything, which is of very great importance. It literally wiped 3/4 of the world. Black Death, it's its other name. So rats can be responsible for many things. So even if we don't have exotic animals, in a city like Mumbai, you will have rats everywhere. They're literally coexisting with us, and they can be harbingers of any disease. They can be reservoirs of any disease. So biological events are not that impossible. They are very much there. They are running on a linear track with us. All it takes is a small driver to push them into the human population, which we call it a spillover in technical parlance. Next slide, please. Now, when this happens, this is a scene very akin to what we see with COVID in India. You can see the PPE. PPE is personal protective equipments, full mask calls, cover up, disinfection, antidotes, and all hypochlorites and alcohol. All these things become commonplace. And this is the current scenario in South America, in a hilly mountainous place called as Bolivia, where this outbreak is currently happening. So what are the symptoms? They are very similar to any common disease, and it happens in a cluster. Many times it becomes very difficult for a modern day doctor to even understand this, because everyone believes that diseases of infectious origin have really been conquered with the discovery of penicillin, and with the vaccines and other things, infectious diseases are no longer a problem. But unfortunately, that is far from the truth. Infectious disease are here to stay, which has been one of our tagline, like pandemics are here to stay. So this pandemics and outbreaks will always happen. Even our human DNA is 80% shaped by viruses. So we literally had a very close relation with viruses and bacteria, and we cannot completely eradicate a biological organism from this biosphere called Earth. They will be with us. The only prudent and the intelligent approach is to understand them and negate them by having adequate safeguard and control measures and mitigating factors, which is not beyond the purview of the human mind. It's very much possible. Next slide, please. Right. When a pandemic like this happens, what are the driving factors? One of the driving factors is poor rodent control and droppings of animals. You know, in Mumbai, for instance, after any monsoon, there is a lot of outbreak of leptospirosis, especially people wading in water. My wife is from Thana. I remember every time I go there, there is a few cases in monsoon seasons, especially clustering in the time of post-monsoon period, where there is a lot of wading of water with barefoot or even with footwear. These particular organism called leptospira can penetrate intact skin, and it can mimic any other disease. So it takes time for doctors to really find out what it is. By then, it kills. It can cause renal failure. It can cause internal bleeding. So leptospira is considered the world's biggest zoonotic disease, because rats are again the reservoirs. So this can happen in a crowded city, which is literally like a time bomb waiting to explode. All it takes is a small event. So contaminated food and water. There is always admixing of water from the pipelines and the sewage. Recently, I treated 5 to 6 cases of cholera in urban Bangalore. This was mainly because water from the sewage gets mixed up with the drinking water, and many people who don't boil this or process this potable water can get infected. Even brushing in a contaminated water can infect you, because all it needs is a small organisms. And mass gathering is becoming a major event nowadays. We always are interested in sports events, in places of worship, in other gatherings of political origin. We are all together in mass, and we have enough mass in India. So any mass gathering has a huge potential for triggering diseases, everything from tuberculosis to outbreak of pandemic diseases. So mass gathering is the newly identified risk factor, and mass gathering can lead to amplification of events which can happen in any city or any urban area. Next slide, please. Now, in this outbreak, which is currently happening in Southern America, it has got a fatality of around 60 to 80% sometimes, and 60% is quite a high fatality rate compared to COVID, which is less than 2%. We are finding it so difficult to manage. Imagine an organism which has got 60 to 90% fatality. It will be like an Andromeda strain left loose on the population. So we need to be very cautious on that. And how does this transmit? Aerosolization. So since air is universal, anything that is aerosolizable, like COVID virus, can be aerosolized. That's how it transmits. When you're coughing, when you're speaking, when you're singing, that is when the aerosol gets generated. So any aerosol-borne pathogen can be a deadly thing to contain, because aerosols are generated during drilling, during even flushing the toilet. I recently published a paper where COVID can be transmitted by flushing your toilet in top of your vertical apartment. And it happened in reality in Amoy Gardens in Hong Kong, and nearly 600 people were infected in the apartment because the person with SARS-CoV-1, the predecessor of this particular outbreak, was flushing the toilet and he had a high viral load. So the simple act of flushing the toilet by an infected person can transmit domestically this viruses and pathogens for vertical livings, especially common in Maharashtra because of the extreme high population levels. So it can transcend to the next floors and infect people. So aerosolization happens in our day-to-day life. So we need to be aware any airborne pathogen can be a big problem. Next slide, please. So I'm going to take you on an interesting journey. This is called paleobiology. This is another possibility. We looked at overcrowding and rats and rodents and outbreaks. This is from the ice frontier. It is from the world's frozen frontiers, from the polar ice caps and even the Himalayan belt. Now, this is a problem called as paleobiology. Now, a lot of viruses and microbes can be preserved in minus sub-zero temperatures for a long periods of time, and they will be in a state of suspended animation. But when human contact happens with them, they can get transmitted to humans. Someone could ask, this is a far-fetched theory, how does it apply to me? I can cite one or two examples. For instance, if someone goes on a trip to a Himalayan belt or a Himalayan glacier, there could be what we call as exposure to these events when there is thawing of ice. As you know, the global climate is increasing and there is thawing of ice in the glaciers and nearby surroundings, and such a thaw can lead to exposure of these events. And as you know, there is a lot of increase in the quantum of ecotourism and polar tourism, which is happening nowadays in India, especially during pilgrimage to these sites, and even as exotic visits and bike and other trails which happens in these kind of sub-zero temperatures can definitely expose people to these kind of very exotic pathogens. So how do these pathogens get there to the polar ice capped areas in the first place? Migratory birds can carry them and deposit. For example, bird flu, the deadly strains of 1918 Spanish flu, they're all frozen in this ice frontiers, and they can get dismantled or they can get disseminated throughout the population once the thawing of ice can happen. We know this is a universal problem now, the climate change and the global warming, which is really, really accelerating this process. Next slide, please. Yeah, so thawing of ice, there was a recent incident. As you can see, there is a reindeer carcass lying in the tundra region grass. And in extreme climates, there was a particular case where 10 years ago, a reindeer had died of a lethal disease called anthrax. Anthrax is a disease which is seen in animals. It is one of the few diseases which is 100% fatal. We saw it in 2001 in the United States during September 11 attacks, post September 11. And this particular bacteria can kill despite treatment many times. And it is also a potential weapon of bioterror. This particular anthrax bacteria, which infects herds of reindeers naturally, this particular reindeer died some years back. But then again, after 10 years, when there was thawing of this particular ice holding, and this bacteria was able to jump into a group of another grazing reindeer, and nearly 200 to 300 reindeers died, and the Eskimo population was exposed to it. And then people had to be called in. They've had to disinfect the entire area with formalin and sodium hypochlorite, and they had to contain and cordon the whole area so that nobody else could enter these kind of contaminated hot zones where the bacteria could spread. This is reality. If only this bacteria jumps into the Eskimo population, from the Eskimo population, it can come to the hospital, nearest hospital, from the hospital to the nurses and the doctors and the primary healthcare workers, from there to the nearest airport, and then to the major cities of this world. So this cycle is very much possible. One could ask, how come Ebola never became a global threat. The reason that Ebola never became a global threat is the villages which were wiped out from because of Ebola didn't have roads to major cities. It was a blessing in disguise. These villages which were wiped out because of Ebola didn't have access to the external world. That is how Ebola didn't jump. But organisms always hitchhike any possible vehicle or human reservoir or other reservoir. That's how they spread their seeds to rest of the world. And once they establish a host, they will unethically or uncontrollably multiply. Their only order in this world is to replicate, replicate, and replicate. Some of the organisms don't even know they are creating damage to you. So this is a very much a possible scenario, even in the Indian subcontinent. Especially, we have the largest mountain in the world and largest snow-covered area, square kilometers. So it is possible in the future people can get exposed to this. Next slide, please. So there are viruses, some of them exotic, some of them well known to us, and some of them previously never known to us, living in these areas. They are preserved. As long as we don't touch them, they don't trouble us. But then again, with the new problem of global warming, this kind of viruses or exotic organisms can get into the human and animal population. Seal, walrus, penguins, migratory birds, seabirds, and polar bear, all these animals are residing in this area. They are the flora and fauna of this extreme climate, and they can be exposed to it. Once animals are exposed, they're called an epizootic. A disease in the animals is called as epizootics. Once epizootic happens, a jump over or a species jump to human population doesn't take much of a time. And every one of us needs to be informed on these current potential microbial threats. These are not distant threats. These are very much a possibility. And we need to keep ourselves engaged in such topics so that we really understand the long-term consequences of such a evolving threat. Next slide, please. So similarly, we all know insects are the major reason for spread of a lot of infectious disease. Everything from mosquitoes to bed bugs and even ticks and rare insects like that South American insect, which is called as beetles and bugs. And these insects can also transmit very exotic diseases. Now, there are parts of the world where mosquitoes are so rare. That is because the temperature acts like a thermal blanket and prevents the transmission of diseases through mosquitoes, which cannot survive there. We all know mosquitoes are there where there is an abundance of rainfall and there is tropical environment where the temperature is warm throughout the year. But with global warming, we can have mosquitoes in areas which never had mosquitoes before. So what does that imply? Increased transmission of Zika virus, increased transmission of malaria, increased transmission of mosquito-borne fevers. We still don't have yellow fever in India. It is only seen in South America. But with climate change, with this kind of global events, definitely these turnover of this insect population from tropical zone to temperate and tundra zones will happen. And once that happens, diseases are going to take a universal or a pandemic scenario, not just in the tropics, but also in subtropics and temperate zones. Next slide, please. Now, these are the zones of thermal restriction. These are imaginary bands of climate severity which exists in very parts of this earth, and we are a tropical zone. That's why we have a lot of vectors and we have a lot of funguses and other things. But in zones where this climate is not so congenial, it's very hard for these organisms to grow. But right now we have a fungi or a fungus called as Candida auris. We see it in all the intensive care units. This particular Candida auris is resistant to all the antifungal drugs. So how do we really deal with someone who has this fungal infection? There is no way we can handle it. Sometimes it can be very lethal. So this particular fungus was confined to certain parts of the world. Because of the climate change, it is now becoming throughout the world. You can see the red dots on the small map there. It shows the global distribution of this particular strain of fungus. So organisms which were in safe keeping or in a snuff box in this world have like an Aladdin genie which is being released. They're coming and occupying other parts of the world. So these kind of turn of events can always give rise to pandemics which were never expected or even predicted or projected in the past. Next slide, please. Now, this is a very interesting arena, and this is called as malignant biology or intentional epidemics. The famous word for this is called as bioterror. Now, microbes are available in the environment. For instance, cholera can be got from Bay of Bengal. There are a lot of cholera cases there. Anthrax is there in the field. So in the past 20, 30 years, we have come to face a real threat or a possible pandemic level threat from the process called as bioterror. As Synergy has conducted tabletop experiments and simulations on CBRNE, we understand this is a huge, huge, huge thing which we have to look out for. With any lab which is capable of creating pharmaceutical drugs and vaccines can also be used for sinister plans. It could be a state operator, it could be government sponsored, it could be an individual who is doing it. In the United States, when there was this outbreak of anthrax, it was found there was a single scientist who worked for NIH, was the one US military facility called as AMRID. US AMRID was responsible for creating this particular powdered form of anthrax, and he sent it to a lot of people, and he wrote it with his own hand saying penicillin can be taken. Luckily, the anthrax was not drug resistant. So this kind of bioterror events can happen in the future. So we need to be very cautious about it. And doctors and healthcare workers have to think of bioterror as a differential diagnosis. Whenever there is an outbreak of massive proportions, it is not a distant threat. It is very much a real and a looming threat. Next slide, please. So any airborne microbial threats, especially with anthrax or novel viruses or synthetically created chimeric form of viruses, biotechnology-based, genomically manipulated organisms, all these organisms can have cluster of disease manifestations which are different from the regular disease manifestation. We are all trained to see diseases based on their manifestation, but this can have a mixed manifestation or atypical presentation to the doctors and hospitals. We will be unable to determine what exactly this organism is. By the time we detected, half the population could be wiped away. Next slide, please. So the surge capacity, which happens after a pandemic or an outbreak like this, can it can tax any healthcare system. Even with COVID, I remember treating a lot of COVID patients, and I had to do it at their homes because they were not able to come to the hospital. The hospital beds were complete. There were ventilators not available. So I did a simple plan of not intubating anyone, putting them on a face mask and using oxygen rented cylinders. We were able to save all of them. We didn't have any single fatality, touch wood. But that's not the case all the time. When there is an outbreak of unknown etiology or unknown origin, doctors and hospitals and networks and healthcare facilities will not be able to maintain or provide care for everyone. We need to annex football grounds. We need to annex churches and temples and places of worship. We need to annex nearby hotels, which are not ideal places of treating people, but they are makeshift places of treating people. And these kind of treatments are subpar. They are in an emergent situation. You can't expect the ideal situation during an outbreak. Doctors are taxed, the nurses are overloaded, healthcare facilities do not know what to do. The organism is behaving in the most strange manner. It is not mentioned in any textbook. Such a scenario will happen, and this can finally destroy global health. Everything we attained, the milestones in global health, can be reversed by one pandemic. It shows our limitation. It still reminds us in a very, very modest way that we have limitations as humans. So what I would like to say at the end of the slide session is we need to be aware of it. We have to take into cognizance all the possibilities are possible with infections. And this is not overstatement. but this is reality, and the looming threat of diseases will always remain, no matter what section of the human population one comes from, no matter what occupation. It is imperative that we understand this deeply, and it really has a direct connection to human life. Next slide, please. So this is a very famous and an interesting thing. During the bubonic plague, doctors used to wear this mask. I bought this mask when I went to Italy as a memoir or a remembrance of what pandemics can do. And they used to wear this face mask, which with a lot of lavender and herbs and other things to prevent from being infected, because they thought bubonic plague was airborne. Unfortunately, plague is airborne, but that outbreak was mostly due to flea bites. And this particular mask became universally the symbol of the doctor who made attempts to go and meet the patient. And we are still masked. Things haven't changed much. In the past 200, 300 years, the mask shape has changed from this bird's beak to N95, but the threat and the treatment and the damage and the loss to human loss remains the same. So this remains like a ever remembrance of something which is of grave importance. So pandemics are not many. HIV/AIDS is a pandemic. We know tuberculosis is a pandemic. Recombinant influenzas like bird flu and swine flu are pandemics. Cholera is a pandemic. COVID-19 is a pandemic. We have contained most of it, and all of them are curable with exceptions to HIV/AIDS. There is something called as a disease X. This is a disease designation given by the World Health Organization to any unpredictable disease which comes in the future. We can never know what it is. And that will remain the gray area of human healthcare and human mind. And we have to open to it. We have to prepare for it. As they say, when you prepare for an emergency, the emergency really ceases to exist. So thank you very much for being a great audience. Any question and answer, I'll go by what Mr. Raghavan has to say. Audio, Mr. Raghavan, your audio is out.
The question is disease X, and I think for the Bombay Chamber of Commerce, Sandeep and Praveen and others, it's the question of how do you keep the stock markets above 51,000? I mean, how do you ensure that disease X doesn't bring the stock markets down? What would be, having gone through a pandemic and having exited it, what would you, doctor, believe the three important points are in terms of being prepared for it? Both from the point of view of an industry and as a nation and society as a whole. Just three very brief points. I know, and then I'll pick Toby's thoughts on this as well.
Sure. First and foremost, being informed about any disease is very important. That is the first step. You know what the disease is, how it can spread, how it cannot spread. So these are the basics of disease, or what we call as 101 of diseases. You have to understand how the disease can spread, how it doesn't spread, and what are the consequences of these diseases. So having the right amount of knowledge about this itself can help you to devise counter strategies. And secondly is your workforce. As far as business is concerned, how do you create an occupational environment safe for your workforce? Because this becomes an occupational problem if you're running a large factory. So how do you make sure that your particular workforce is saved from a pandemic like, for instance, like COVID itself? So how do you ensure that your workforce can be protected against this? You can have somebody who is an advisor or a health consultant who can tell you what are the things you could do. You can even on a casual basis contact them and ask them what are the things we need to do in a factory, what are the things which are not required. Some people overdo things which are not required. For example, if you ask me between a mask and a hand hygiene, I would insist on the mask, not on the hand hygiene, because the hand hygiene can always be washed. Even if you don't wear a gel, at the end of the day, if you don't touch your face and mucous areas, if you wash your hands, it's good enough. But what is more important is the mask. Even if you have a person sneezing with a COVID positive person sneezing on your hand, if you wash it with soap and water, it negates the virus completely. It's an enveloped virus, so sodium hypochlorite as well as caustic soda can kill it. But if you are not wearing a mask, any exposure to your nasal cavity cannot be reversed. That is one thing. Secondly, I see a lot of people not complying correctly. The intent is good, They want to protect themselves, but the compliance is bad. For example, masks are worn below the nose.
No, I'm sorry, doctor. I'm sorry. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I just wanted to steer your thought purely to disease X and not to COVID. You see, there are several issues that we face when it comes down to COVID. When you're talking of disease X, is it possible? I mean, fundamentals. You have already, we've written about it. We've heard about building of primary health infrastructure. Public health infrastructure is the critical aspect. From a business point of view, one who believes that this pandemic is over. How does one prepare for that disease X? I mean, something that's extremely different from what you have already seen, as you pointed out.
Exactly. The disease X could be very similar to COVID. It can be very dissimilar to COVID. We never know how it is going to turn up. It is always a mystery, even for people who are in the biological arena. What is most important is if you are open to the outbreak of diseases in the future, that itself is a great stepping stone in containing it. First of all, we all like to put an end to things. Okay, COVID is over. There's a sense of, like a liberating feeling. We kind of like to take it to the streets. We like to be in a celebratory mood and things that we have conquered the disease. We are moving on. There are no other problems. That is something which is very risky. We always need to remember any outbreak can take the world by a storm. Had we been careful by 2003 when SARS-1 came out, this wouldn't have happened. So we need to be mentally prepared and informed on any mysterious disease which can outbreak very soon in the future, which can be airborne, insect-borne, animal-borne, and other things. This is the first thing which we need to be careful. The second thing is, when it happens, the earliest source of best information should be used to safeguard your health, your workers, your occupational people there in the factory, in your industry, or your large-scale export zones or SIPCOT-like industrial areas that need to be addressed very soon. And then thirdly, information on this particular outbreaks can be a lot learned from previous outbreaks. There can be no disease which doesn't have footprints of 60% similarity to former diseases. If you have a containment program for COVID, you will also be able to contain Ebola someday. So even if this containment program is not aimed like a pathogen like Ebola, which has got a 90% mortality, but the commonality and the basics remain the same.
Right.
If you are able to contain airborne pathogens, you are addressing all airborne pathogens, not just COVID and common flu and common cold. So the basics are the same for most diseases. Avoidance of exposure. Exposure avoidance is step one. Number two is understanding how the disease progresses. Number three, what are the occupational related? In India, occupational health as a specialty is still not developed. Right. In the Western world, every factory has an occupational health consultant who will tell you what is the kind of mask you should do, what is the kind of worker safety has to be followed. In India, we don't have that occupational health. So any healthcare workers who is dealing with infection and other things can be consulted. Public health specialists can be consulted. So some outbreak comes in the future which could threaten your business like COVID. You can't really prepare for that in particular because we still don't know what it is. But any preparation for a disease like COVID also extends to this unknown threat which is in the future. So that is enough of a deterrent to contain future threats. Just prepare for COVID or make your facility COVID friendly or prepare to protect against COVID-like diseases. That is all enough for a future airborne threat.
Right.
So this is how we extrapolate whatever we have right now to something which will be very cryptic in the future. For a common man or a person who's in the business arena, you go and tell him you have to prepare for disease X, which we don't know is a lethal pathogen, but it could be through. It can be very, very abstract and very vague, and he wouldn't be able to address it directly. So instead, if it is a COVID compliant facility, then Ebola can be tackled. That's what I would like to highlight.
Okay, interesting. Prepare for an Australian pitch if you've played in Australia, so that you can play in England as well. But Toby, exactly. Toby, from the point of view of a business and the fact that how far have we come in terms of pandemic prediction models, given what Dr. Gifty has pointed out in terms of the fact that viruses that are pandemics that are there and epidemics that you see in South America could well replicate itself in other parts of the world, given that changes in temperature, it could spread across the board. From a business point of view, in terms of securing itself and preparing and factoring the threat, what do you think are the key challenges? And in terms of models of predictions, given your experience with advising on asymmetric threats that exist, where do you think we need to move forward?
Veera, it's a good question that you ask, but the challenge is always how do you factor risk in our day-to-day life? The bigger issue is we are not prepared to think about it until it happens to us. Okay, so even if you do all the predictions and you are able to do some early warning, okay, people are not willing. It's like taking an insurance policy. You will wait for your first heart attack to come before you start taking an insurance policy. Okay, that's number one. The second is between threats that come naturally by nature and the ones that are done, let's say, with an intent. With the ones that are done by an intent, you cannot stop it. It'll come because it is done by people who have resources. Okay, so we are talking about the next generation of warfare, which is not going to be on missiles and bombs. It's just going to be on knowledge. 2, 3, it's called GNR warfare. Few people can think in a small lab. You don't need big access to raw materials or rare earths or nothing. So I think we have to make that distinction. There is going to be ones that are knowns and unknowns. The fact is, as Dr. Gifty said, start the preparation. For example, he brought about Ebola, and we were in Africa around that time. And one of the things that we realized was the Africans treated it as a home disease. So one of the first things that when we started doing this recommendation in India, when we made an exit policy for the government of Karnataka, which we said, treat it as a home disease. Don't bring the COVID patient to the hospital because you will paralyze the hospital system. The regular guy who got cancer and cardiac cannot come there. Treat it as a home. But slowly you are seeing that most states are saying, okay, you quarantine in your house. Now, if we had, with Ebola, which had a more than 90% fatality, if they could contain it largely in Africa by home quarantining, I think this could have been a standard operating procedure that we could have favorably adopted in the beginning because this had only 2% casualty. So I think there is no straight line answer, but it's all about, which I used the first word, fail smartly. Be prepared to fail, but learn how to fail smartly. I think we have to we are exceeding time. If there are some questions, please, Veera, allow them to ask.
We've got questions that have come into the chat. Sandeep, you want me to take those questions, or should I take those questions? Yeah. So
please go ahead.
Yeah. So the first question that's come is from Prateek Paul, who says he's a bioinformatics student. He is asking, and I put this to Dr. Gifty, how to know which gene or sequence we need to target for its treatment or control?
Paul, I think that's a beautiful question, and I'm happy you're into bioinformatics. It's a beautiful area. It is nothing but computational biology, where you use computational power to determine the sequence of viruses and bacteria. And now during COVID, the gene sequencing is done using, how do we find this is a UK strain or a South African strain or a Brazilian strain, is through bioinformatics softwares. Now, how do you really identify a genetic particular code which can have lethality, and how do you address it? I think that is the question he's trying to ask. Now, if you look into the microbes, there will be virulence factor and edema factor. There are toxins. In case if you take anthrax bacteria, there is one particular gene which is responsible for virulence. So if you are able to use this gene by bacterial conjugation, you take the gene from one bacteria and put it into another bacteria, that bacteria can also use this. This can be done in many ways in the lab. You can co-culture this bacteria, or you can use molecular scissors or restriction endonucleases or enzymes, slice it, anneal it. You can treat it like a piece of metal. DNA can be treated like a piece of metal. So is RNA. So you can do all this genetic workup to create novel chimeric forms of organism, which will be refractory to conventional treatment. That is the big problem. For example, let me cite the example of COVID, which is recent. It will be fresh in everyone's mind. Whenever there is a talk of COVID, everyone says our immune system needs to be strong. Unfortunately, if your immune system is extremely strong and good and robust, the chances of dying from COVID are very high. That is the reason we give them steroids, we give them monoclonal antibodies to dampen the immune system. So some organisms are able to counter your immune system by making it overreact. The bat and other animals don't have any problem with the COVID virus because their immune system doesn't even react. They are immunotolerant to this organism. So when somebody modifies a organism, as Toby said, in a laboratory, as Raghavan said about an asymmetrical approach, in this kind of asymmetrical warfare, you take a huge army or a huge conventional armed forces with the asymmetrical David Goliath approach. So when you are fighting this kind of battles with the intent or state-sponsored, it is almost impossible to contain these viruses. I can tell you a small example. There is a bacteria which is called rickettsia. Rickettsia, you don't give sulfonamide antibiotic because rickettsia multiplies with sulfonamides. If someone can take this rickettsial gene and put it into a cholera bacteria, the cholera bacteria will multiply in the presence of antibiotic, and the doctor who is treating the case will be killing the patient. Because in modern medicine, you give 100 milligrams of doxycycline, it doesn't work, you make it 200 milligrams. It doesn't work, you make it 300 milligrams. At the end of the day, this antibiotic can provide the stimulus for bacterial multiplication. Is it not paradoxical? Antibiotics supposed to stop the multiplication of bacteria. So these kind of things are possible with genomic manipulation of organisms. That is why the dual use technology and genomic things are very much regulated everywhere in the world. And unlike chemical weapons and biological weapons, there are no traces in biological weapons. As he said, you don't need rare earth, you don't need uranium, you don't need polonium, and you don't need any evidence. 2 or 3 ampules of bacteria are enough to wipe out 20 to 50% of the population. Take, for instance, chemicals like ricin, which can be taken from castor seed. It's a very simple way of doing things, and all you need is 20 to 50 ml, which can address a huge population because it's a best known toxin known and antidotes are not available. So the intent is very important, and the resources are already there in this world. And we have known telltale signs of clandestine activity happening in some of the labs around the world, which is not very much, there is no evidence. Just because there is no evidence doesn't mean those activities don't happen. Everything in the world cannot be really put in an evidence format. So if you are dealing with a genomic organism, first thing is your disease pattern will be atypical. It will not conform to the regular disease syndromic description given in textbooks. It will be novel, and sometimes whenever I get cholera, for the simple reasons, I give 2 or 3 antibiotics for the simple reason that it could be drug resistant. This is a naturally acquired cholera. But in bioterror, you need to give 4 or 5 latest antibiotics, presuming this organism was created 4 or 5 years back. That time, this antibiotic was not available. So I will avail it because the bioweaponeer didn't have access to this antibiotic. So it's unlikely to be resistant to this new launch antibiotic. So we give already 4 or 5 different antibiotics with different mechanisms so that we can contain bioterror. If you have a bioterror related anthrax, which is genetically modified.
Let us not go into that bioterror.
Yeah. So, yeah, so I think this kind of modifications can happen. So genomically, if any organism is modified, then addressing it through antibiotics and other things is very difficult unless we study the general structure and then go into addressing that particular issue.
Right. Thanks, Doctor. Next question that I've got, one more from Rose. She says, how do we work? I mean, it's a question we've addressed, but how do we work on controlling these pandemics, considering that ecology and health are not prioritized? Certainly, I mean, quickly, if anybody wants to weigh in for this, That's the only other question that we have. Toby, you want to weigh in for this quickly?
Yeah, I think it's another good question. I don't want to say much, but issues regarding to climate change, you have Americans walk away from it. Some people think it's important, some don't. But climate change is going to be a huge contributor to all the viruses that are going to come out. Dr. Gifty has shown about the polar ones. We have many examples. So I think it will be very difficult to develop a textbook that will be compatible to everybody, because every country has their own political ways in which they work. But I think as individuals, as small groups, as companies, as organizations, we can take steps to make sure that we are as immune as we can be.
Right, thanks, Toby. Sandeep, those are the only two questions that I have. I think we've already run out of time in case you...
Yeah. So Praveen is getting disconnected. Praveen is supposed to do the vote of thanks. If he is there, then he could. Praveen, you want to go ahead? Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's a big eye opener and a fantastic webinar that we had in the recent past, because we understand that ignorance is not a bliss in this time, kind of a time, and scientific knowledge keeps supporting the societies and the generations over a period of time, to deal with various kind of unprecedented situations. I think it's a formal time for me to offer the vote of thanks. This particular webinar was proposed by Synergia Foundation and has been developed. Bombay Chamber has tried their best to promote this amongst various stakeholders, the academic community, the bureaucrats, and the corporates, to try and extend this information and knowledge for their own well-being. Special thanks to Mr. Toby Simon, the founder and president of Synergia Foundation, Mr. Veera Raghavan, the consulting editor, and Dr. Gifty Emmanuel, the scientific director of Synergia Foundation, who have done a tremendous job for holding this webinar. And we also thank all our participants who who have taken up their time from the busy schedule to be the part of this discussion. And we will keep having this kind of discussions over a period of time, because all this becomes a part of our advocacy activities with Government of India to make our public health system more citizen friendly and more efficient. So thank you to all. Thank you to Bombay Chamber staff, Synergia Foundation, and all our participants. And we look forward for having more engaging discussions in the near future.
Yeah.
May I just, in case, since we couldn't play that video, that our introductory video at the start, I don't think everyone could hear it. Could we just leave all the audience with that video? Could I just play that once? If you're okay with that?
Yeah, and we will end with that. So thank you, Veeragwan, Toby, and Emmanuel. Toby will be in touch for similar kind. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, right.
Thank you to everyone.
Share screen.
The world was shifting on its pivot with the death of Ayatollah Khomeini, the supreme leader of Iran, and the suppression of democratic protest at Tiananmen Square, China. The rivets in the Iron Curtain were beginning to pop, first in Poland with the Solidarity movement, followed by the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dismantling of apartheid in South Africa. Having witnessed these events, we were deeply affected and began to ask ourselves what we could do to impact the lives of people having to cope with such tectonic shifts. A timely meeting with Mr. Ahmed Kathrada, the prison mate of Nelson Mandela's for 26 years, and subsequent visits by us to South Africa, helped better understand the plight of people living under extreme conditions of apartheid and the epidemic of AIDS in the African continent. The genesis of the Synergia Foundation began with her decade-long work with Nobel Prize winner Médecins Sans Frontières and World Health Organization in building affordable treatment paradigms for AIDS that have saved the lives of millions of afflicted patients in Africa and around the world. This pro bono effort helped us realize that it takes only a few people with the right intent to make an impact. Working with several international organizations, including the International Red Cross and Pharmaciens Sans Frontières, Synergia helped in coordinating relief efforts for more than 200 humanitarian missions in Africa, Central America, and Asia, including earthquakes in Maharashtra, Peru, Gujarat, and the tsunami that affected southern India. The bombing of the World Trade Center in New York brought about a paradigm shift in global security, and the focus has now gravitated from traditional security to human security. The foundation soon realized that its evolved strength was in providing deeper, multidisciplinary insights to governments, security practitioners, industry, and civil society on the causality of such disproportionate threats. The 6 international Synergia conclaves on human security held in Bangalore have provided both insights and intervention techniques to key stakeholders. The Synergia Foundation has brought some of the finest strategic thinkers in the world, including M.K. Narayanan, former NSA to Government of India, Carl Bildt, former Prime Minister of Sweden, Joseph S. Nye, former Dean of Harvard Kennedy School, Michael Chertoff, former Secretary, U.S. Homeland Security, Shiv Shankar Menon, former NSA to the Prime Minister of India, Uzi Arad, National Security Advisor to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Melissa Hathaway, former Cybersecurity Advisor to Presidents Bush and Obama, Sir David Oman, former Permanent Secretary of the UK Home Office, and G.K. Pillai, former Home Secretary, Government of India. It has been a constant endeavor of Synergia to stay ahead of the learning curve by collaborating with some of the finest academia, including the Welfare Center at Harvard University, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and acclaimed think tanks in the world, including Chatham House in the UK, the Munich Security Conference in Germany, and the Center for New American Security in the United States. Synergia's experiences have been consolidated in bodies of knowledge, shared with clients, collaborated with partners, and enhanced through new associations. The Foundation works to provide preventive and preemptive solutions to corporate executive boards and governments and help clients reimagine their business in an asymmetric world. To know more or engage with us, do call us